Hindul Sengupta. Dr. Gautam Sen is back with me talking about an issue we've been discussing for a while now, Bangladesh. This week, of course, we saw those images of Joe Biden hugging Mohammed Yunus on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly meeting in New York. Of course, Mohammed Yunus also had a meeting with Karim Khan to try and figure out whether Sheikh Hasina could be accused of war crimes and if she could be persecuted in the international court. All of this we will discuss with Dr. Gautam Sen. Dr. Sen, welcome.
Thank you.
Your first remarks when you saw, these images of Joe Biden hugging a beaming Mohammed Yunus, because simultaneously, even and with all the news that has come out, even Bloomberg now is beginning to say quite clearly in their headlines that the Islamists are taking over Bangladesh. But Mohammed Yunus went to New York and absolutely, totally denied this.
But he has since said that the leading light of the revolt was the Hizbut Tahrir student leader, Mahfouz Alam. He has publicly stated in a meeting with Clinton, and this is a radical Islamist group banned in many countries. So this is not true what he's saying. It is really an Islamic movement. He really has no political base. Mohammed Yunus is a stopgap prior to a serious consolidation which is now being organized from Washington to truly consolidate a new rule. Now, we need to bear in mind that the real threat to Bangladesh and US interests, or indeed Chinese interests, come from India. India is a big player where Bangladesh is concerned, and they understand India is now more than willing to intervene in some shape or form. So really, they have to consolidate Bangladesh in a way in which it can resist Indian influence in the medium and long term. So everything that has happened in Bangladesh since the ouster of Sheikh Hasina is to do with India. Now, we may argue the US presence in Bangladesh suits India because they will organize themselves with Myanmar, border areas, to take action against China. That really doesn't suit us, that the United States would take action against China in our neighborhood. This is not something I don't suppose we are willing to accept, nor should we. So the whole name of the game is to create facts on the ground which will cause much greater public estrangement between ordinary Bangladeshi people and the Indian government. Bear in mind, though Awami League has really retreated in a very severe way and they have been hurt quite seriously and much action is being taken against them, particularly the Hindu activists of the Awami League have been targeted. Bangladesh, there is still a substantial amount of Awami support because they were the people who brought independence to Bangladesh, and Sheikh Mujibur Rahman was the founder. So this is an area in which the new regime has to take action to make sure that they suddenly do not reappear and with Indian help. So what is happening is this. The killing of Hindus is a provocation. This is deliberate. Of course, many of the Jamaat people are more than happy to attack Hindus because the Enemy Property Act allows you to seize property of those who have fled Bangladesh. It automatically is forfeit. Now, it should be forfeit to the government, but that's not what happens. People locally of the Awami League and BNP usually take over. So to terrorize Hindus has a very strong economic motive. And this, of course, was a very big gain for many people in 1971, with so many Hindus fleeing. The Enemy Property Act. That's one thing. The other thing is, see, they are saying everything which will annoy the Indian government. For example, quite a lot of people are now opposing the Bangladeshi national anthem written by Rabindranath Tagore. They're saying this is not an anthem we had, it is written by a Hindu. So that's provocation. The open outreach to Pakistan is really a case of waving red rag to a bull. They really want to say to India, we're going to reverse the verdict, which we tried to do once before in 1975. So these are all the most egregious forms of provocation so that India overreacts and does something which will annoy the Bangladeshi people. And I repeat, we don't know how many people are happy with what has happened. Look at the demonstration in New York of so many people, and those were not Hindus, these were Muslim Bangladeshis talking the language of constitution and legality. And who does Muhammad Yunus represent? He is actually a usurper. So they want to make sure that what they have brought about in Bangladesh is durable. Bear in mind, it seems to me that the casualties that happened with Hasina are also deliberate. Hizbut Tahrir played a role in the background to attack the police and the security forces in order for there to be a reaction, which there was. I believe at least 400 people got shot. Remember, the Tunisian revolution started with one person dying in the streets of Tunis. Virtually the same happened in Kyiv, with a small number of people being shot by the government. Now, this is a well-tried and tested method. It works very well. So they did this in Bangladesh, and they carried on doing it until the dam burst. And the army said, crowds are so big, we can't hold them back. Now, maybe the chief of staff, despite being a relative of Hasina, was quite happy to do what he did, that is to force her to leave. But I do believe it became very difficult for them to hold back the mobs from outside her residence. So what is happening is really an attempt to consolidate the region. This is a medium-term aim. The longer-term aim actually was articulated during the Delhi Diet, I think by, who is in jail now, the two, Islam, I forget his name, the chap.
Imam?
No,
Are you talking about the chicken's neck issue?
Yeah.
Shachil Imam.
That is where it was first articulated. Now, the US and indeed the British, going back to the 50s, have always cast envious eyes on the Northeast. And Bangladeshis are now saying, we have the capacity to cut off the chicken neck. I think they could. It's what, about 20 miles wide, or I think a bit less. So that is feasible unless the Indians take very strong military action. Cutting off the chicken neck will immediately precipitate secessionist calls from Nagaland, Manipur, Mizoram, immediately. There's also potential for trouble in Assam. So this is the longer-term plan. And my anxiety would be that the United States manages to implant a friendly government, a government extremely dependent on it for their survival in Delhi, and then puts this proposal to allow these states quasi-independence, de facto independence, virtually amounting to de jure separation of India. Countries break down. Nigeria, USSR, Sudan. Why not India? Why can't India lose territory? India lost territory in 47, and we have de facto lost the Northeast. You cannot have any religious ceremonies of a Hindu kind in Nagaland. They've allowed it. It is not, strictly speaking, completely under the control of the federal government of India. So this is the long-term plan, because it is possible. It is possible to do it, that you cut off the chicken's neck and then see what happens with a friendly government in Delhi, which does not react.
Two or three
So
things
these
come
are
to
very
mind,
big
Dr.
questions.
Sen. Sorry, please go on.
No, these are very big issues. And I think New Delhi is aware of it, but much depends on how much the Indian electorate cares about freebies, subsidized electricity, free transport, 1,500 rupees for every woman, which actually hasn't been delivered in Himachal Pradesh, from what I understand. So it is up to the Indian people.
There are a few, nuances here which, I think we should unpack a little more. Let's begin with the question of Mahfouz Alam, this character, this student leader mastermind, so to speak, who is now being openly credited. Now, of course, Bangladesh was, abuzz with conversations about him throughout this entire quote unquote revolution. And now, of course, he's openly being credited on stage for having driven this. Now, Mahfouz Alam actually wrote this, I think, social media post where he denied that he was part of the Hizb ut-Tahrir. And the Hizb ut-Tahrir, of course, remember, was the organization, was the Islamist radical terrorist group, which was behind the Holy Bakery attack infamously in 2016. Now, he said he was not part of the Hizb ut-Tahrir and not part of any Islamist group. He said he was against these groups. Actually, the interesting thing is Taslima Nasreen, and this thing about him being connected to Hizb ut-Tahrir, in a sense, came out after a tweet by Taslima Nasreen. But before that, the buzz in Bangladesh was that he was a communist, he was a Marxist, he was, a sort of radical left. And therefore, many people suspected that he might have Chinese connections. And this, of course, then makes the waters more murky than before. His note, of course, Mahfouz Alam said that he was, neither, part of any radical group, neither Islamist nor radical left. He was against all of that, and he was just, practicing Muslim, devoted to his country, and so on and so forth. But this is tricky because one doesn't know where he stands really. We know that the Chinese have been supplying a lot of armaments to Bangladesh, including, of course, those submarines, BNS Sheikh Hasina, and so on and so forth. You mentioned Pakistan, and of course, this entire thing that immediately after this interim government came, Muhammad Yunus cleared this deal to buy exponentially more arms and armaments from Pakistan. And of course, where does Pakistan get those armaments from? No doubt a large amount of them are from China. So this makes the waters more murky, isn't it, Dr. Sen?
Well, this arms purchase actually was part of the provocation. This was part of the provocation, really, that we are buying Pakistan. But this really has an echo back to what happened in 71 with the genocide and mass rapes. Mahfouz Alam, of course, is not to be trusted in anything he says. This is a cover. It's like David Headley was a double agent, US double agent, working in Pakistan and for the United States, which is why they never passed on information about 26/11 with complete clarity. They told us something was afoot, but they wouldn't go beyond that. They did say somebody would land off the Indian coast. Now, what he says has no meaning, and nor was he the leader. This is actually, again, a way of denying US culpability. He was simply a front, possibly an important one, possibly a key intermediary, but this could not have been organized by him single-handedly. And the US and the British have been in Bangladesh from the early 70s, 75. One of the coup plotters ended up as head of the BBC World Service, Bengali World Service, whom Sheikh Hasina wanted to have repatriated for prosecution. He actually, I think, is probably retired if he's not passed away. So what Mahfouz Alam says of no significance, he was probably working for the United States because the United States has had a much longer footprint in Bangladesh than the Chinese. And the Chinese may have been outwitted. That too happens. The book on Bangladesh and the coup in 75 was written by a very close friend of mine who was at Cambridge at the time, Lawrence Lifshutz, The Unfinished Revolution. And you will find my name in it, being thanked for providing regular dinners while he was writing the book. And he also said the Americans were very much there. They knew the assassination was going to happen. He said they had foreknowledge. He did not accuse them of direct participation, but he said that they knew in advance. So the Americans have been there, and it's entirely possible they outwitted the Chinese, and they were perfectly aware of arms supplies. they are probably happy that the arms supplies were not coming from India, because the real threat to their interests comes from India. Because India is very much there in Bangladesh. It has a long history, and the Chinese are really Johnny-come-latelys. Of course, Bangladesh is heavily in debt to them, but so are 30 countries around the world. That in itself is not significant. I do believe Bangladesh is going to be a base against China on the coast, the Bay of Bengal, Myanmar. My fear, as I've already said, is what plans do they have for the Northeast? And to them, if it's easy, let's do it. The principle of doing it and violating sovereignty has no meaning. If it can be done, and if there's a sympathetic government in Delhi, and basically you want a very vulnerable government. The government has no room for maneuver and will have to acquiesce. That will be the key. And if Pakistan attacks India simultaneously, the room for maneuver of Delhi will be limited, despite all the huge reforms in our armed forces and armed services in the last 10 years. Great changes have taken place, but this is not a challenge any government of India would wish on itself. So I think something is afoot. Delhi is aware. Exactly how we will respond, I don't know. With reluctance and regret, I've changed my mind about the cricket match. I am prepared to swallow the fact that we played cricket, because this was the kind of provocation the United States wanted for us to ban the cricketers. That would have been something which would have made many Bangladeshis very unhappy. And at least we should be playing for time. And this was good politics. And our people have done the correct thing. And I have to confess, my initial reaction to feel we shouldn't play was premature. We have to play for time, and that's exactly what we're doing.
Let's talk a little bit about the other meeting that I alluded to right in the beginning of this conversation that Mohammed Yunus had with Karim Khan, essentially trying to find ways in which Sheikh Hasina, who I believe is still in India and did not get a visa to the UK or the US or any Western country. UK particularly seems strange because, of course, her own sister is a British citizen and her sister's daughter is a sitting Labour MP. So that is particularly surprising. But I think there are the moves to try and accuse her of war crimes, and therefore, under that accusation, to bring her back to Bangladesh. Now, this makes the situation very tricky for India. Can India just hand over Hasina? What will happen to her if a case of war crimes is lodged against her and Bangladesh asked for her to be returned to Dhaka?
If I'm correct, using violence against your own citizens during civil disorder is not a subject within the remit of the International Court of Justice. The accusations against Putin and the head of the organization which brought Ukrainian children into Russia. So this may not be within their remit, but the demand to repatriate Sheikh Hasina is again a very strong way of discomforting India. This is really a way to wrong-foot India, because for India to send her back is pretty much unthinkable, and I don't think the Indian government will do it. They'll probably just keep quiet and make very few comments. Of course, if I think a formal request has already come from the Bangladeshi government, they will simply ignore it and say very little, because there is nowhere else Sheikh Hasina could go. I think the behavior of the British government is rather disgraceful, but there is actually something else we need to consider to explain why they have said no. There are two facets to this. One, Sheikh Hasina would be a target for assassination in the UK, as I'm sure she is in India, and it would require significant security resources to protect her. And I'm aware this is not an insignificant matter. Secondly, they may have also thought her presence would provoke street fights between her supporters and supporters of the BNP SA in East London and elsewhere, that she would precipitate a law and order situation, which the British government can well do without considering all that's happened over the Gaza protests. So that may have also been a factor in them refusing to allow her to come to the United Kingdom. I don't think she asked. They actually unilaterally announced they would not let her come. So there are additional reasons apart from the fact of bad faith.
It's also tricky. I mean, there was talk that she was going to go to Finland, which is the first thing that we heard, that, Sheikh Hasina would go to Finland. And that seemed logical because, after all, one must remember that even Taslima Nasrin first found refuge in a Scandinavian country. And even that didn't happen. So the Hasina question remains complicated. And what is going to happen to her? Let's turn once again, towards Bangladesh and what's going to happen. The Bangladesh
Let me just
army.
quickly say,
Yeah.
Finland is an option if she has to leave India. Definitely, and it's being talked about. She has some connection with Finland going back some years. So that is an option which will save India's face without having to respond to Bangladesh requests. Sorry, carry on.
And that could probably be a sort of, a solution that saves face all around and yet keeps her safe. Let's turn our gaze also towards what's happening in the Bangladeshi army and the Bangladeshi army's role in all of this. As I pointed out, a lot of their armaments are beginning to come and has come in the last decade from China. Now, Chinese infiltration within the Bangladeshi army is a question, is being hotly debated. One doesn't know what are the final contours of that. Surely that has an impact in the wider Bay of Bengal region. The Chinese are desperate to get into the Bay of Bengal, of course, as you yourself were alluding to a few minutes ago.
I think that the army's role is not significant in the sense that you can find alternative supplies for weapons. And Bangladesh's needs are not so great that NATO could not step forward to provide them with alternatives, which the Bangladeshi army might prefer, given the reputation of some of the equipment the Chinese have provided them and others, which are of very poor quality. And I believe there is a question of whether or not there's rishwat, some money changing hands to satisfy senior officers. So that isn't as much of a problem. I think a bigger problem is what kinds of memories army officers, ordinary soldiers have of their parents and grandparents, perhaps, during 1971. What are the memories they have of the liberation war? I know the army was not entirely sympathetic to independence because it was really a Pakistani army, but a very big part of Bangladesh society was involved in the revolt against Pakistani rule, and the atrocities impacted Muslims as well, because the Pakistanis were saying we will create proper Muslims by raping their women. So it was not just Hindus. So this actually is the underlying reason why the Indian government ought to be waiting and watching to see, when all of this settles down, what do the people of Bangladesh want? Now, they will have to hold elections. The question is how they now fix that in advance of the actual ballot. What do they do to the Awami League to prevent them from participating fully and effectively in any election? For example, prosecuting many of the leaders, eliminating the middle cadre to make it much more difficult for them to be a significant electoral force. This is, I think, what is happening now in Bangladesh. The Hindu story is appalling, but it really is something the Jamaat likes doing anyway, and the Americans think this is a good way of upsetting the Indians and creating a backlash within the Indian public, which the government of India may not be able to ignore.
Now, few things are happening with the Hindu story and minority story in Bangladesh, which I want to discuss, Dr. Sen. One, of course, is, for the first time, already Hindu pujas and, other things, rituals and festivals were being attacked in Bangladesh for a long time. And of course, we all know that the sheer numbers of Hindus have consistently fallen in Bangladesh. But the other thing that's happening now is this entire demand that wherever namaz has been offered, those open grounds, because those were the grounds where Durga Puja used to be held in many, many localities across Bangladesh, none of those open grounds can be used. And in fact, in many places, a sort of tax has to be paid by Hindus to Muslims and Muslim organizations in order to have Durga Puja. This sounds ominously like jizya.
Well, again, if they flee, this is very convenient for those who are engaging in this kind of action. If they flee, you basically take over their land and their property. So that would suit them just fine. And many people would like Hindus to leave, but there are, I think, 70 million of them left. Not an insignificant number. But you can only kill so many people in a short space of time. So if you want additional provocation, you do things like this, that you cannot hold a puja. Now they're saying you will not be allowed to immerse the idols in any river in Bangladesh. So all of these are ways of harassing the Hindu population, the minority population, and waiting to see who in India will react to this. And already there is a reaction in India, at the moment mostly reserved to the social media, but there is some pressure on India. But I believe Indians have not gone beyond making unofficial representations both to Muhammad Yunus and to the US government. And I think their hands are tied. This is the tragedy for Bangladeshi Hindus. They're caught in a geopolitical trap. And there's not a lot you can do about this.
The interesting thing, of course, is that the Hindus are seen more organized than ever before. I mean, for the first time in Bangladesh, there have been repeated large protests by Hindu organizations, including a recent one, I think only yesterday. And the other thing that's happening in the Chittagong Hill Tracts is, of course, that the tribal populations of Bangladesh are now facing a lot of onslaught, as always, as one had predicted. But they are beginning to arm themselves. And there is also a demand to create a separate sort of Hindu nation, as it were, carved out of Bangladesh, which would merge into a Hindu Desh, which would merge into India. Now, all of this also is unprecedented. There is a churn that's happening there too. The tribals are not taking this lying down, and it would seem nor are the Hindus.
I do believe they've had some encouragement and help from outside. All of this organizing takes time and money. In 1949-50, when Sardar Patel was still alive, the first really big massacres happened in Bangladesh, and 1 million Hindus were murdered in that period. And there are documents which actually go through this. In fact, one document written by, put together by jurists in India, which was published in 1965. It's on the internet, a very long document, very careful study. And at that time, Shyam Prasad Mukherjee and Sardar Patel proposed to Jawaharlal Nehru that we must create a safe zone for Hindus in Bangladesh. We must intervene to create a safe zone. In fact, a separate country. And if that fails, we should intervene militarily. This was the proposal of Patel and Shyam Prasad Mukherjee. Nehru threatened to resign as prime minister and go and work in a Muslim relief camp. So nothing came of it. And this was followed by the Liaquat Nehru Pact and the resignation of Shyam Prasad Mukherjee and Mr. Niyogi, the other Hindu Bengali cabinet minister. So this has a long history. Of course, the Hindu population was much larger then, but it was also Pakistan, which was not hesitant to commit mass murder, which it has never been. So what India now is doing is to send a message without going public, without offending the mass of Muslims in Bangladesh. So they are not sitting on their hands. Something is going on, discreetly, I'm sure, but I don't believe this will come to anything very much, because the army will crush the tribes, people of Chittagong Hill. It's just a question of how much blood they're prepared to shed. And for the protests in Dhaka and other cities, quite large, nothing very much happened. They protested, they had meetings, and then they went home. No specific action was taken. In fact, the threat not to allow immersion happened after the protests. So it might have even been counterproductive. All of this, in the end, is to test India's patience and provoke ordinary Indians who will then try to oblige the government to take action, because the government is capable of taking harsh action, but they have not. They could have said, we do not want your Hilsa fish. They didn't do that. They have not cut off Bangladesh's power supply, which Adani could well have done, because they are sustaining very major losses. So much is in prospect in the not too distant future, but not just quite yet. And I do believe India is acting with due care diplomatically, and people should be more sympathetic to the difficult choices they are having to make. They are difficult choices and very upsetting for ordinary people, including someone like me.
Let's wrap up this conversation then, Dr. Sen, with one final question, which is what happens to Yunus next? It's an interim government. In recent interviews, Dr. Yunus has said that perhaps it'll take 3 months to make the structural changes that are needed, maybe 6 months, after which an election would happen. How do you see this roll out? Because the Awami League is regrouping.
You know, it's difficult to think of any one person in Bangladesh, anybody, who has credibility as an international figure to provide a fig leaf of legitimacy. It's Muhammad Yunus and only Muhammad Yunus. And his remaining as the chief advisor will continue really until they have managed to create conditions in which the Jamaat and BNP will win. So this may take 3 months, may take 6 months. They really are busy creating the conditions in which their candidate, the candidate of Washington, is going to emerge victorious, and they can say, look here, we've had elections. So this may actually take 3 months or maybe a little bit more. I don't think there will be any difference after November if Donald Trump were to become president, because this is against China, so he will let it happen too.
Handing over Bangladesh to the Islamist, Dr. Sen, is this the same mistake, or it suspiciously sounds like the same mistake America has made before?
Not at all. Since the 1930s, Islam has been entirely a weapon in the arsenal of the Anglo-Americans, initially the British and a little bit the French, and since then it's been a weapon in the arsenal of the US government. Every reform movement has been thwarted in the Arab world. Pakistan was Islamicized under the supervision of the United States. The Taliban was formed by the CIA. The head of the ISI has publicly said, yes, he was at that meeting where it was being organized. So Islam is very useful because they cannot survive without outside help. They never quite have the majority's public support except by resort to force, which is what is happening in Iran. Resort to force. So Islam is a very useful ally. There is a backlash and a price to be paid, of which 9/11 was one. The bombings in London were another. But I think they are very cynical. They're willing to pay this price for their larger geopolitical goals for the United States of America. So Islam is the only group, the only grouping which can secure Bangladesh for the United States against India. They're the only ones who genuinely detest India, and they have to be on the saddle with a political party. But maybe BNP will not be quite as decisive because the leader is already quite old. She's slowed down. There is no obvious successor. But the Islamists are there and the only well-organized group in Bangladesh who really are not going to ever allow Bangladesh to return to India's fold voluntarily anyway. So Islam
this is not,
is
but the
useful,
Americans
but
only
yes,
get
there's a
so
price
much
to be
by
paid.
keeping Bangladesh away from Indian, Indian sort of oversight, as it were, or deep engagement with India, because the real goal is to keep Bangladesh away from the hands of the Chinese. And will the Jamaat be able to deliver that? Because from what I understand, the Islamists are also deeply infiltrated by the Chinese.
I think this is an issue they will have to tackle, but I don't think it'll make any difference. The US will be so dominant in Bangladesh as it is in Pakistan. They went away for so many years, they came back, and the Pakistanis did what they were told. this is exactly what will happen to Bangladesh. It'll have no say in any of the key geopolitical issues in order to retain power in Bangladesh. Now, India is a country they want to control. They haven't been able to do that yet. If they're a weak government in Delhi, there'll be no trouble in Bangladesh either. They will control India through the Hindi opposition. And then they will carry on. They will deal with India. They are not against India per se. India is far too important. They're against any government of India which does not listen to them. And that has been the case, actually, not just for the last decade. It's been the case for a very long time. There have been moments of vulnerability, but India has always reasserted its autonomy. Now, this is what they want to break. And if you look at how they broke every single NATO country over Ukraine, you know what kind of ally they want. Somebody who does what they're told. Otherwise, why would Germany sacrifice their economy, which they built with so much effort after the post-war calamity? India is a country they are not going to allow to mess with Bangladesh unless it is sympathetic to what the United States is doing. And they will say, look, this is for you too. What we are doing is for you. And you hand us over Nagaland, Manipur, Mizoram. You let our people run the show. It's also well advanced in Nepal. All this is one single territory. Nepal is, according to a very senior Nepali politician, 1/3 Christian already. This is, well, Nagaland is 98%. It was 2% in 1947. So all of these are long-term plans and not what happens in the next 5 years.
Fascinating. Dr. Sen, this is, of course, in equal measure concerning and from an, I guess, an academic strategic point of view, also fascinating to see what's really developing. I'm sure we will have opportunity to discuss this more in detail with you as weeks and months go by and as the situation unfolds in Bangladesh on what happens with Sheikh Hasina, what happens with the Jamaat, what happens when elections are finally held in Bangladesh, and indeed what happens in the, you know, in the border areas with India, including around the Chicken's Neck. Thanks very much, Dr. Sen, for your time and for your astute observations on what's going on in this region.
Thank you very much, Indur. Thank you.